Hey, everybody. Welcome to GROWL Agencies. This is our Storyteller series presented by GROWL. This is Civil Conversations Project. My name is Greg Olson. I'm the CEO of GROWL Agency. We do this show once a month, and it's really been exciting to host it. I get really excited, the opportunity to kind of research and talk to these gentlemen. Today, we have really the host of this show is Wayne Hare, who's founded the Civil Conversations Project. And it's been my honor to get to know him. Every week we have a conversation, and he's really taught me a lot. And it's an opportunity for us to use our show and our reach and to really record and to educate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes here to have Wayne kind of introduce himself. Who is the man behind the Civil Conversations Project. Then I'm also going to turn it over and let Dwight, you can introduce Dwight and have you guys, because we're going to probably get into some heated conversations here about Confederate monuments and kind of back and forth things. But why don't I have Wayne, why don't you take it from here, kind of introduce yourself, and then we'll let you and Dwight introduce each other, and then we'll take it to the next level.
Thanks, Greg. I had to disappear for a moment because my dog was scratching at the door and wanted to come in.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm Wayne Hare. I'm a retired federal park ranger, and part of my thing for a long time, Greg, has been trying to get more people of color running around in the outdoors. And as the years went by, I began to see the lack of ethnic diversity in the outdoors as kind of a part of a bigger issue, just race relations and just race relations and kind of the weird dynamics of race in this country. And so I began to focus more on racism with a capital R.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been associated with a magazine called High Country News for a long time. I've been on their board, and a few years ago they started to ask me to write about race, and really one thing led to another. And when race started to enter politics, it's always been in politics, but when it started to get really strongly involved in politics, and maybe 2014, 2015, 2016. I just began to write more about it. The project that we call the Civil Conversations Project at High Country News kind of morphed into its own separate nonprofit, and the whole mission statement, the goal of the Civil Conversations Project, Greg, is to try to have civil conversations that will change the narrative that America tells itself about race. So we have kind of a false narrative, and civil conversations kind of playing the long game, but little by little, we're trying to plant seeds in people's heads to have a better understanding of race in this country.
Yeah,
so that's a short story long.
No, I know. We're going to get more into that on the show today. And we have recordings from all our previous shows. And I appreciate the opportunity. Again, I think in sometimes of our conversation, I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't know some of these things. And you actually made me feel okay because I wasn't taught certain parts of history or brought to light. So it's been fascinating for me to go through. And also it's been neat to know you, and you're out speaking on different organizations to law enforcement around the country. So, I mean, you kind of go where there's a calling for you to come out and help bridge these stories. So I do appreciate that. So let's go. Do you want to introduce Dwight? He's kind of a longtime friend, cohort of yours that you've known for a long time. And then we can let Dwight introduce himself too, and let him. What's kind of fascinating? Maybe something Dwight can say fascinating that you know about Wayne, and maybe Wayne something you know about Dwight for our listeners.
I'll do a pre-introduction of Dwight. All right. As I said, I came out of the National Park Service, and when we started to, so I've always heard people when they talk about race bring the Civil War into it. And forever, and to my embarrassment, I always poo-pooed that. I go, well, the Civil War was a long time ago. Nobody that is alive today ever owned slaves. Let's focus on today and not 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But as as my knowledge and evolution evolved, I began to understand how that the Civil War, that slavery in the Civil War, they kind of set, they cured the foundation. They set the not just the tone, but they set the whole entire way of being and relationships between blacks and whites. And so as I tried to understand it, I reached out to a friend of a friend, and that turned out to be Dr. Picaithley, who, and I guess I'll let him finish his introduction, but the short story on Dr. Picaithley is that he's one of the country's leading experts in the whole Civil War era. And so he and he's been educating me, honestly, for a number of years, since maybe 2013, I believe. And an awful lot of what I've learned from this gentleman right here.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Dwight, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. Why don't you give us a little, who the heck are you? And maybe a little again, I'd like you to let the listeners know a little something about Wayne, because they, he has a lot of fans out there. So.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm one of them. I'm one of them. Wayne and I know each other through emails and that sort of thing. We've never met face to face. We're looking forward to that moment, that evening, whatever it is. I spent 30 years with the National Park Service as a historian, moved from Santa Fe to Boston to Washington, ended up quite luckily, fortuitously, as chief historian of the National Park Service for my last 10 years, from 1995 to 2005. I retired then, moved to southern New Mexico, and for the last 15 years have been researching the causes of the Civil War. There's been a lot on it, but I wanted to take a deep dive into the official documents, not knowing what that might be, but that roughly a 12-year dive resulted in a book that was published 2 years ago by Kansas, titled The U.S. Constitution and Secession, a documentary anthology of slavery and white supremacy. I'm finishing up another book on Tennessee's secession documents, and moving then on to Virginia's secession documents. So there's plenty, as Wayne might tell you somewhere in this conversation, there are about 9,000 pages of official, formal, published documents dealing with secession, generated from December to April of 1860, 1861. So there's just no shortage of information to look at. It's of a piece. It tells us a great deal about why the South needed to secede, and I'm trying to bring that out in these books.
All right. Well, I appreciate you being on the show today. Again, I mean, it's just as we continue to tell these important stories. So, let's get started. I think, Wayne, unless you want to go down a different path, but I'm going to open it up and kind of to start the conversation. One of the things we talked about, I think today we're going to have a discussion around Confederate monuments. And as we've discussed this between the three of us about keeping up some of these monuments, and I think, Dwight, if you have a number in your head, pull that together for how many monuments we think. We had this discussion about what's a monument and what's a park, so it's a pretty big number. So really discussing, should we keep these monuments up as part of this false narrative that I know, Wayne, you can talk about what that false narrative is, or should we remove them or keep them up and put historical relevance? We talked about things like if they're in the middle of a southern city square where they're on a big beautiful horse, which I like how you described that sometime, or is it in a battlefield, right? At what point? Really, the listeners, as they work with their communities and things like that to understand, I want to go through some of those. So I know we'll get into explanation of lost cause and states' rights again, so we can constantly educate on what that is, and then more about the Civil War. So maybe we start that conversation around these Confederate monuments, Wayne, and and let's see where it goes from there.
Yeah, let's see where it goes, Greg, because it's such a deep and complex and emotional subject. But the monuments were put up for a reason, and were put up at a certain time in our history, and they are said to represent our history, right? So folks that that advocate for leaving them up, that think they're a good thing and that they show our history and want to leave them up. The question would be then, what history do you think these monuments represent? There's so much confusion about the Civil War. I think that Dwight could tell you that in his courses that when the students come in, between 80 and 90% of the students don't understand the reasons for secession that led to the war. Generally, it's believed that it was a war about and a conflict over the noble cause of states to determine their own life and their own future, states' rights. The Pew Research organization has found that something like 40% of the American public believes that, and something like 48% of teachers teach that. James Lowen, who wrote a couple of bestsellers, Lies My Teacher Told Me and Lies Across America, his informal survey says he's more in line with what Dwight says. It's more up around 80 to 90% of teachers believe that that's what the Civil War was about. So when you have these monuments that people argue passionately for leaving up because they represent history, the question then becomes, well, are we talking about the history of states' rights, or states that fought to preserve their own rights, or are we talking about states that fought to preserve slavery and bondage? And so the truth is that the Civil War was only about one thing, and that is slavery, and perpetuated by white supremacy. Almost all the monuments that got put up, Greg, were put up in two eras, right? Towards the end of Reconstruction, when we're kind of shifting from having rights for these freed slaves to federal troops leaving the South and Southerners trying to return the South to the way it was, sending a message to freed Black people, or during the Civil Rights era, in the 40s, 50s, and even the 60s. I'm going to kind of see if Dwight wants to jump in here and has anything to say about the false narrative of the years of secession and the Civil War.
Well, yeah. You're right in that most of the monuments came out at the end of Reconstruction and during the early and mid years of the 20th century. And it's clear that many or most of them certainly in the 20th century, put up during the Jim Crow era, were put up on government grounds, courthouse lawns, state house grounds, city parks, and they were put up with a very clear message to remind the Black citizens in those towns that the white man was very much in control. It was a very strong message. And some of them were perverted history. Actually, the New Orleans monument, which has now been taken down. I think, Greg, you put up Mitch Landrieu's book on dealing with the Civil War, the so-called New Orleans riot monument, which honored the white people who killed large numbers of Blacks because Blacks wanted Louisiana and New Orleans to recognize the rights they had gained in the 14th and 15th Amendments. So these monuments they're of the Civil War. That is, they reflect the Civil War, being generals and so forth, but they were put up with a very specific purpose to perpetuate white supremacy. More about that later.
Yeah, one of the interesting part. So I'm looking for examples too, either from both of you, of certain like Confederate monuments that used to be up are not in town squares and things like that. So as you go through this, think of any kind of, examples, right, of this. And I appreciate the one on New Orleans. One of the discussions we've had together as a group was, when is it right to keep up monuments? Or, at what time do we try to correct history by a plaque? Or one of the things, Dwight, you talked about was, do we have a monument of Dred Scott as the same stature and quality facing eye to eye some of these other monuments to help tell that story better? Or do we take it down and lose all the thing? One of the quotes I had from you is there has to be bad guys, right? And to tell that story. And Wayne, I think you remember that. We were talking with Dwight. So I guess that's where I'm leading both of you is like, and Wayne, I understand your point of view is like, yes, it's wrong. The history's wrong. So what do we do moving forward with this? And then we can get into some more of these other discussions.
Yeah, the Dred Scott issue is an interesting one, and it came to mind very early in this new move to remove Confederate-related monuments. The city of Baltimore, very early, or like earlier this year, I think, or late last year, took down a statue of Roger B. Taney. Roger B. Taney, it was in a public square. Roger B. Taney was a noted jurist. He was Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for about 35 years, maybe, appointed by Andrew Jackson, didn't retire. He didn't retire at all. He died in 1864 during the Civil War, and most famously is known for his Dred Scott decision.
Which was, I mean, I just want to clarify that. So listeners, wasn't that around, he didn't consider African-American citizens, right? Is that where we're going with that?
Part of
just
it.
part of it, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, and because then Dred Scott unsuccessfully sue, right? In the Dred Scott versus
Sanford
case in 1857. So I'm just trying to bring some clarification to our listeners about this because we throw around a lot of names and dates.
Sorry.
Kind of, no, it's good. I've been doing a little bit of research. So I just want to clarify that about, interesting that this Chief Justice considered African Americans not to be citizens. So not good, basically.
Yeah, Dred Scott was a slave that was taken by his owner into a free state and a free territory for a period of about 4 years. They returned to Missouri. He sued for his freedom. It ended up in the Supreme Court. Yep. Roger B. Taney took it upon himself to write the decision. And in 1857, in March of 1857, he declared that a number of things. One of them was that Dred Scott was not free because he was not a citizen of the United States, and he was not a citizen because he was black. Couldn't be a citizen because he was a slave, but because he was a black. And as he famously wrote in there, it's been the belief for some time that black people didn't have rights that white people needed to honor. He went on to talk about slavery in the territories, and at the end of it, a little known part of it, he declared that property in a slave is expressly affirmed in the Constitution, meaning that slavery was protected in the United States Constitution. It wasn't, but that was his interpretation. The South loved it, the Republicans hated it, and largely ignored it. So that's the Dred Scott and Taney relationship. So okay. Baltimore took down the Taney statue, and I thought it was sort of a reflective comment. Not that I'm a big fan of Roger B. Taney. I think he's a fascinating guy. But they could have also put up a statue to Dred Scott on the same grounds, same size, same sort of definition of statue, facing each other, so that they could have a conversation and we could have a conversation about their conversation. And that got me to thinking largely that, and I think I've seen the city park where the statue used to be, and it's quite large. You could also put next to Dred Scott a statue to Frederick Douglass, who was a Maryland native, or to Harriet Tubman, a Maryland native, to provide a counter narrative and challenge the dominant narrative that exists if you only have Roger B. Taney standing alone in this city park.
All right. I appreciate that because we're bringing things up to speed again. Every month, I try to bring our listeners and myself to make sure I'm somewhat historically correct as I learn these characters. Wayne, you look very solemn, very serious sitting over there. I know there's a counterpoint. We love this discussion. Pretty much you and I we've had this discussion between the three of us of there has to be bad guys, but we're trying to make history right versus, but we sometimes don't feel like we should even have these monuments up at all. So I'd like to hear, your thoughts on this or wherever you want to take it from there.
Well, hey, I'm not very serious and somber, and
I'm just giving you a hard time, Wayne.
So glad I look that way or whatever. It's a great. What we're really trying to do with this series and with this project is to promote an accurate and true understanding of race in this country, right? And such a big part of that is the Civil War and slavery and the white supremacy that, and I don't know if it was either developed because of slavery or slavery was developed because of white supremacy, but so these given that so many of the people in this country really don't understand or don't believe, and probably in many cases choose not to believe what that era was really about and what secession and the war was really about. It's critical to bust into that narrative so that we can, if we're going to tear down this building, we need to tear down the foundation, and the foundation is the white supremacy that came along with slavery. So, this podcast today is not about Roger B. Taney, but I want to make it really clear that not only did he deny Dred Scott the freedom that he, according to the Constitution, was allowed to have, but after he announced that decision, and he could have just said, here's what we decided, and then been done with it. But he felt the need to kind of take it to the next level. And here's what he said. In the course of his remarks, the Chief Justice took occasion to assert that for more than a century previous to the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, Negroes, whether slave or free, had been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with a white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect, that consequently such persons were not included as people in the general words of that instrument and could not in any respect be considered a citizen. That's some white supremacy shit right there. Yeah. And so we have these monuments to white supremacy that people rally around, and often in a very violent manner. And in talking to me, you'll hear me use the word organic a lot. I'm not so interested in just having a rope being thrown around a statue and having being yanked off its pedestal. If you've gotten rid of the statue, have you changed anybody's understanding of history and white supremacy? Have you done anything other than get rid of the statue? So Civil Conversations, was a project to educate readers and listeners and people to what the actual history of the country is as it relates to slavery, race, white supremacy, and all that. And it's my belief and certainly my hope that if we can instill that knowledge and education, instead of having to fight people, two sides come together with clubs and guns and a rope to yank down the statue, instead of having to fight each other, it's my hope and my belief that process of removing this false history, changing this false narrative, which is, the statues are just one display, one physical, visible display of that whole false narrative, that all that change could happen organically. And instead of being, continue to be divided You know, if you yank down a statue and that's it, you know, you cut it off in a truck and jackhammer it apart, you still have the divide that you started with. And in fact, it's probably deeper, wider, and worser than it was. And so I want to see them come down for sure. I want to see them come down because that's what Americans want to do, is we understand the history. It's not proper to have that up there. It's a false history. It's a damaging history. We understand that. Let's get together and take it down.
You know, and we are seeing them come down, and I don't think we have, we want to talk a little bit about, I think in Montana, which was, you were telling me, was the closest one we probably have located to us here in Colorado. Am I correct on that? Because Pam is an Altorado? Am I getting that correct? Yeah, so there we had a monument that came down years ago. And I don't know if you and Dwight, I mean, I think there was good reason. I mean, the reason's really great. And as I was reading some of your writings, Wayne, on some of these things coming up, and maybe that's a great example. I was really surprised that we had a monument in Montana, a Confederate monument.
Yeah, you wonder. I was too.
Yeah,
and that's why I went up there. And I don't know if it's the closest one to where I live in Western Colorado. There's 6 down in Arizona, and I might be kind of midway between Phoenix and Helena. But I was like, how did that happen? You know, I knew enough of history to know that Montana wasn't a state during the Civil War.
Sure.
And I knew it certainly wasn't a northern or a southern state. It just wasn't a state. Yeah. And so I was curious, how the heck did we get a monument up there? And there's an organization that existed from right after the war and is still exists in existence today. When the National Park Service decided, when they wrestled with how to present, Civil War battle sites and historical sites from that area, they wrestled with how were they going to interpret that. And so at the helm at that time was Dwight, and he, as I understand it, from another mutual friend, he got together a contingent of leading historians, and they pretty quickly, I think, decided that the war was about slavery, and let's present it that way. But I think that he got some pushback on that from an organization, this United Daughters of the Confederacy. I think there was some. I've heard through the grapevine that he got some pushback on that. And so more than any other organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group of genteel Southern women who simply want to keep the noble history of the South alive, because after all, they were fighting to maintain their independence in the midst of a genteel, benign, happy, friendly organization called slavery. That's their narrative, and they've done an amazingly good job of pushing that narrative. And so they didn't particularly care, if monuments went up on battlefield sites. What they cared about to this day is perpetuating that story, that's become known as the lost cause. So how they ended up in Helena, I don't really know. I do know that the territory of Montana leaned pro-slavery. It's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of, up in Helena, there's a lot of place names, Confederate Gulch and Uniontown, and just a lot of Jackson Street or Jefferson Street, I think it is, I guess. They just honor the Confederacy. So they put up this monument, in theory, according to the plaque, to kind of honor the new smoothed over relationship and the sense of brotherhood between the North and the South. But it's a monument to the false history of the Confederacy. And they were interested in, and the UDC put up or financed or arranged to have put up monuments all over the country in places that had, that kind of like Montana, weren't part of the country at the time, or in several cases I can think of, to honor the Civil War dead or the Confederate dead in places that didn't have any Confederate dead. They're just random places to put them up. So there's nothing, really unique about Helena that they wanted a monument there, other than it was just one more place to gather and tell their false story.
Yeah. So Dwight, is this really around that Southern heritage that we've been talking about and things like that, that's going all the way up into, Montana to help tell that story? Is that what you're, can you dive a little bit deeper in this with the United Daughters of the Confederacy? I didn't know much about them either.
Yeah, they became very active. They and the Sons of Confederate Veterans were established in the 1890s by sons and daughters of Confederate veterans to perpetuate the correct memory of the war. And that war was that it wasn't about slavery. It was about other things like states' rights or the Constitution or what have you. And they were very aggressive, correcting textbooks, creating Confederate primers that you can still find. There are echoes of that in a lot of states' rights literature and lost cause literature still going around. There's a fairly new book out titled "It Wasn't About Slavery," which is stunning, given my research. But this idea that we need to make it about something else is very, very powerful. And the UDC was at the center of that through the early years of the 20th century and continued. Of course, they're still in operation, and they were putting up monuments. In New Mexico, which was a territory during the first half of the Civil War, I-10, which runs from El Paso west to Tucson and Phoenix, had markers up labeling it the Jefferson Davis Highway. And in fact, in the 30s or 40s, the UDC worked with Congress and created a route from Washington through all the Confederate states, across the west of California and up to Oregon and Washington. And in New Mexico, there were 4 or 5 monuments at rest stops, at federal highway rest stops, declaring it the Jefferson Davis Highway. And the markers were sponsored, they said, by the UDC, and these were put up in the 1950s, as I recall. The state of New Mexico has now taken those down. You cannot find them, but it's a testament to the need on the part of the daughters and partly the sons to remember their heroes of the Civil War.
Greg, I'm going to comment about another monument because it gained a lot of
yeah, please.
It gained a lot of press a few years ago. It's called Silent Sam. It sat on the campus of the University of North Carolina. It was another one of hundreds of monuments that were arranged and financed by the United Daughters.
What's the name of it again, Wayne? Sorry.
Silent Sam.
Okay, Silent Sam.
So, when the UDC financed and dedicated Silent Sam in 1913, which is 48 years at the end of the war, 26 years after Reconstruction, and right in the midst of Jim Crow, they recruited, to dedicate it, they recruited Julian Carter. Julian was a prominent industrialist and ranking member of the KKK to speak at the dedication. So Carter's dedicatory remarks helps us understand the true nature of the Confederate statutes. First, he credited Confederate soldiers with saving, and this is a quote, the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South, adding, today, as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states that seceded. Praise God. Then he went on to tell a personal story as he was dedicating the statue. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, albeit is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed this pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards, slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. Yeah, history to states' rights. It seemed like the guy who dedicated Silent Sam didn't think so.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. When I was thinking about that monument, and I looked up, it was toppled in August of 2018, and I'm not sure, it's interesting where that is now, but I was reading a New York Times article, and I'll read this here. The university thought it had found an answer, and this is from February 14th of this year, answer in November when it reached an agreement to give the statue to the North Carolina Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and fund a $2.5 million trust to display it somewhere off campus. But rather than settle the issue, the pact infuriated professors, alumni, and students who accused the university's board of governors of entering into a backroom deal with the white nationalist group. So we're still struggling. I mean, obviously we're going to be struggling with this for a while. When I start to look up what is happening with these monuments now, because they're not, Wayne, you brought this up to me before, they're not being taken off and like jackhammered into pieces. We're actually there's a struggle, a deep struggle going on still. And I didn't even know there was Sons of Confederate still happening. So, thanks for bringing this to light. I don't know, Dwight, do you know any more information about that, with these kind of things happening?
I don't. That's pretty much what I know about it.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that I grapple with is trying to understand the context for these monuments, or particularly for the statues. And most of them put up by the UDC were put up in a town square next to the courthouse, next to the State House grounds, on a city park,
Yeah.
and they stood alone. They were not just the dominant narrative; they were the only narrative for that, and pronounced as we've talked about, were the message was not let's remember the Civil War, but let's remember white supremacy, the foundation for Southern secession. When you take them, remove them from that city square, and you put them in a museum, let's say, and many of them are small enough to be put in a museum, you've instantly changed the context. You've put them from a political context into an educational context, where you can theoretically have a conversation about what they are, what they meant, who put them up, why did they put them up, and that sort of thing. To that effect, I would argue that all of the Confederate statues on battlefields, whether those battlefields are state-run or run by the National Park Service, are in museums. Our national parks are, in effect, our national museums. And the point there is not to think about removing those monuments, but to think about how do we interpret them? What kind of context do we build around them? And I'm reminded of the Robert E. Lee statue at Gettysburg, which is fairly similar, I think, to the one in Charlottesville, maybe larger, certainly on a big pedestal. But it's at the western end of what we call Pickett's Charge. And it's not only does Gettysburg have a ton of other monuments, mostly to United States troops and generals and so forth, but Lee stands in one interpretation, in a context that you can easily create, to his arrogant folly of sending thousands of men to their deaths in that charge across a totally open field, where on the other side awaited them United States troops behind a stone wall with many batteries of cannon. And it was, of course, a massacre.
One thing, we freeze. There we go. You hear me there, Wayne, okay?
I've got, yeah.
Okay. One thing Dwight brought up too before was, as a way to manage this.
But as an immediate failure at that time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Any comment on that, Wayne?
No.
Okay, well, no, that's good. I mean, one thing you brought up, Dwight, before was, as an opportunity, do we create monument parks, right? Like, I think it was Sandy Livingstone's, was it his book? written in stone you brought up to me.
That's right.
That how that story begins in Europe, where they tear down old statues and they're creating monument parks. And Wayne, I'm not saying that's what we do. I'm just saying, like, how do we make history not go away so people can be like, they can go to a monument park to learn what's happening. And I don't know if we have anything like this in the US or if they're sticking these statues somewhere. I know that you brought that up to me, Dwight, and I found that interesting.
Yeah, Sandy Levinson, in a book that I highly recommend. It's 20 years old now, 22 years old, I think. Now, Sandy is a constitutional a law professor at the University of Texas. It's a wonderful thin book about what do we do with these monuments. And his example was in, I think it was Poland, where you have totalitarian states coming and going. Each president erects a monument to himself, a statue to himself. Then he's overthrown. What do you do with the statue? And they decided to create a park outside of town and just move the statues out there. So you can drive around or walk around this park and look at these monuments to past presidents of this country. I don't know that we have anything like that here, but the underlying sense there is you change the context. It's no longer at the core of the government on the courthouse lawn or the state house lawn, but it is in a different context. Sandy Levinson uses the Confederate monument on the Austin, Texas State House grounds as an example throughout a lot of this. I think it's still standing. It's an impressive monument, as you might expect. And it seemed to me that you could move it somewhere. I don't know quite where you would put it, but you could also, going back to my Roger B. Taney example, put up counter-narrative monuments. For those of us who are old enough to watch the Watergate hearings, Barbara Jordan was a Black congressman from Texas, very articulate, had a voice like God's, who is much beloved, was much beloved in Texas. I don't know if she still is. You could easily put up a monument to her in juxtaposition to that monument, or a monument to Milton Holland, who was the only Texan to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Milton was a Black man, a slave. He wasn't very Black. He was his father was also his owner. And sometime in the 50s, his father, a man named Bird Holland, took Milton and two of his brothers, and the owner was also the father to those two boys, took them to Ohio, set them up on land, got them in school. The war comes along, the Emancipation Proclamation comes along. Milton and I think one other brother enlist in the USCT, the U.S. Colored Troops, and outside Richmond in 1864, Milton acts in a heroic way and is given the Congressional Medal of Honor. He survives the war, doesn't die until 1904. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery with a large stone. You could erect a counter narrative to the Confederate monument on those grounds by putting up a monument to Milton Holland. It's part of Wayne's educational process. Let's think about Black people and Black men who served in the United States Army during that time as a counter narrative to the Confederate monument that's on the Capitol grounds.
It's certainly a lot to think about. And I mean, these things are not easy discussions, and nothing nothing happens quickly, does it, Wayne, in these types of, there's lots of opportunities for change. And one of the things I know as we're wrapping up here with a few minutes left, one of your goals through all this is the true history of succession. And I think we'll continue to have this discussion, but what are your thoughts on that, Wayne? I mean, where can we look and where can we turn? Where can our listeners that are listening today and we have recordings of this, where do we turn them to start learning more about this?
Well, I guess I'm going to be like a politician and answer another question
Yes.
that you kind of brought up there, Greg. You just said, none of this happens fast. And so far it hasn't happened fast. But when I was growing up, I used to hear all the time, well, African Americans or Negroes, you're trying to move too quickly, give it time. And, I'm frustrated with that.
Yeah.
I think it could happen fast. There's a lot of optimism about all the support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and I see that support, but I also see a lot of hard core, dug in, and even violent pushback.
Yeah.
And you know, I just think that people need to come together and push back hard against that pushback and make this happen, and without going through another 401 years, you know, or 155 years, however you want to count it. So you know, we're working pretty hard just to get that education out there in a way that people can, you know, it doesn't raise a hair in the back of the neck. You know, something that they can listen to. These are such hard, emotional, you know, dug in positions that people take. As we are wrapping up, I would say that there is, you know, there's something like 1,800 monuments on public land. I think there's a few thousand more, but the best I can find is between 1,500 and 1,800 on public land. I guess other than the fairly recent African American Museum on the Mall, I don't know that there were, you know, really, I guess I can't say that there weren't any tributes to Black history on public lands, but certainly not 1,800. And the only one that really addresses racism in a really dramatic way is a fairly recent museum in Birmingham that was created by Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. And there they pay you know dramatic tribute to the over 4,000 Black Americans who were lynched between the end of the Civil War and the middle of the 20th century. And I think it's worth noting as we totally wrap up here that if you take a map of these monuments that are in theory honor the lost cause, and heritage, not hate. If you overlay that with a map of lynchings, if you overlay a map of monuments over a map of lynchings, it looks like the same map. And I think I'll wrap up with that, Greg. But
that would be an interesting visual that we'll have to explore more to show that as a information. Hey, Dwight, any last closing comments? I really appreciate your knowledge on the show. Really helps me personally, and I know a lot of listeners, but any closing comments?
Well, it's a great opportunity, and I thank you for the invitation, both you and Wayne. It seems to me that much of the conversation we have about this revolves around the meaning of the Confederacy. What was the Confederacy? Why did the South secede? And I think the more we can understand that, and it's not clouded, it's very clear. Again, there's these 9,000 published pages documenting why the South seceded. If we understood more clearly that the South really did secede to protect slavery and to protect white supremacy, it gives a dimension to our conversation that allows us to move from A to B instead of just yelling at each other of whether it's heritage or hate and about the monument. So it's really about understanding what the war was about, what the Confederacy was all about, and what did those men think they were doing when they seceded. And I would urge people at a minimum to look at the 4 declarations of secession that the secession conventions in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas produced, particularly the Texas one, to give you an understanding that they firmly believed that what they were doing were leaving the United States so that they could adequately protect slavery and white supremacy.
All right. Well, this has been a really great show. Our next one will be, I believe, October 20th, third Tuesday of the month. Unless Wayne has he's out there helping, fighting fires. He's doing a lot of different things out there. So we do appreciate that. I appreciate both you gentlemen taking time today. We'll also post all this content up on our page for everybody to read. We'll have Dwight's book up there. A little plug there, Dwight, to buy your book. Thank you very much for all of you. So with that, we're going to close out, and you can hang on a moment here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg and Dwight. Appreciate both of you.